And just like last time, so we're on section 4, I bolded the questions that people asked me about. So we had this question: what was the Iwakura mission? How did its members view the West? What were the results of the mission? Right, so that's the Iwakura mission. That's the famous picture I like to show. And you can see this is a group of Japanese who went to the United States and Europe in order to try and understand what was going on there, to understand what made them so powerful. And you can see even at this early stage, right, they're dressed mostly like Western people, right? That's their kind of style. We even got, even the guy who's dressed like a Japanese has a top hat. And they went on their own steamship. They actually built a steamship and traveled there themselves, right? So they're already quickly borrowing from the West. But they also found it very strange. I won't read through the entire quote, but they were really struck by Christianity, which, you know, for them had been an evil, illegal religion. They see was very popular in Europe and the West. And they said, it's really, really weird, but it unites the people, right? Everyone follows this religion. It unites the people. What we should respect in a religion is not its argument, but its practice, right? They're saying, here, Christianity has this positive effect. It unites the people in the country. They're not going to try to use Christianity to do that. They're going to use Shinto, right, to do that. Now, they had gone there originally to try and obtain treaty revisions. Remember, Japan had been forced to sign these unequal treaties. They want to revise those. They fail. They're not able to do it. They're not considered advanced enough by the West. But they come to believe that they need to continue learning about the West. They, from that, they say, okay, these Westerners are more powerful. We need to engage in very deep reforms if we want to be like them. One thing they're struck, though, you know, they look at all these governments in the West. The most powerful ones, Britain, the United States, France, and Germany, all have constitutions. The English Constitution is not written, but they all have constitutions. And they say, okay, we need a constitution too, because every big power, except for Russia, that's strong has a constitution. We need one too, but they're afraid that that could lead to division, right, rather than consensus, when what they needed was unity in order to strengthen the country. So there's always this kind of tension where they realize to become strong, they have to allow democracy and some rights, but if they allow too much, it could lead to division, right? They have to figure out how to balance that. They resolved the problem of Christianity simply by removing the signboards that said Christianity is illegal. They never came out and said it's legal. That doesn't happen until the Constitution of 1889. But they remove the signboards, and they say the government is no longer going to require you to have a Buddhist funeral. So if you don't want to have a Buddhist funeral, that's fine. And the reason they did this, they were constantly facing protests whenever they went to a Christian country. Well, all the countries they went to were primarily Christian. Everywhere they went, they were facing protests because of how they were treating Christians in Japan. What were the characteristics of the People's Rights Movement? So the Meiji government, even though it was in the name of the emperor and for the emperor, was dominated by people from Satsuma and Choshu. I haven't been going over this, but like every single person we've talked about that was major, like Yamagata Aritomo, Ito Hirobumi, were all either from Satsuma or Choshu. And a lot of people kind of resisted that. One person who did was this guy, Itagaki Taisuke. And he issued a memorial to the government. A memorial is like a kind of letter that you would write to the emperor. It's like a public letter saying, I think that we need to do something different. It's like a policy proposal. And the policy he proposed was we should have a constitution. Right? Remember, they're just learning about this in the Iwakura mission. He says we should have a constitution. He leaves the government. He was actually a member of the government. And forms what's called the Patriotic Public Party. So he forms one of the first political parties in Japan. And they become quickly very active in calling for reforms. Women even begin to do this. They will address meetings with men in them. They will be leaders in this movement. You might remember we watched the video about how all these Japanese farmers were writing their own constitutions. That's happening as part of this people's rights movement, right? These Japanese are writing their own constitutions. The government realizes that it's going to have a constitution. And this is where the Meiji government was really smart and practical. They said, okay, it's clear we're going to have a constitution. Let's get ahead of this. And they announced, in 10 years, we will promulgate a constitution, right? But we will write it, right? We will write it. And so this kind of and then at the same time, they tightened up the censorship laws to kind of control any kind of debate that would happen about the Constitution. And remember, their Constitution was written by one guy, Ito Hirobumi, in secret. And then he released a book that explained how you should interpret the Constitution. So the only question we had here was what were the characteristics of treaty revision? So remember, again, Japan had these unequal treaties it didn't like because it forced it to do things like it wasn't free to set its tariff rates. Remember, tariffs are taxes on imports. and if you want to protect your industry, you set those high. Japan was not allowed to do that, and that's one reason why they wanted treaty revisions. They could get rid of these unequal treaties, they could have their full freedom and sovereignty. So I don't expect to remember every single detail, but what I want you to understand is how difficult this was, right? In 1886, they tried to make a deal that would have gotten them a lot of treaty revisions, would have made the situation a lot better, especially regarding to the tariff, but a lot of people resisted it because it gave all this power to foreigners. Right, the Japanese law codes would have to be accepted by foreigners, and they would have to hire foreign judges whenever there was a case between a Japanese person and a foreigner. Right, there was resistance to this, and it was so strong that the foreign minister was actually forced to resign. Right, that's in 1886. So, and I don't expect to remember the exact years, but I do want you to understand that there was this kind of resistance to it. Right, Japan wanted to revise the treaties. Right, but it was hard for them to get a good deal, and that could lead to popular resistance inside. They tried to get it in 1889, they got a better deal, but many Japanese people still opposed it. How bad? Well, Okobu Shigerobu, the new foreign minister, there was an assassination attempt on him, and it actually blew off his leg. He lost his leg in an assassination attempt because a Japanese person was so angry at the New Deal. Right, trying to get these treaties revised, and the assassin would then commit seppuku. The treaty would fail. This finally, I think, convinced Western people not to be too hard on Japan. They were like, okay, the Japanese negotiators are negotiating with us in good faith. They're trying to give us a good deal, but they face a lot of pressure from their people. We need to kind of back off. And they finally agreed to a treaty revision deal. It goes through in 1899. This is why they made it around this time period, but it was set to. They made the treaties, but they weren't set to take effect until 1899. This is one reason why they want to establish democracy and have a constitution, because when people don't feel like their voices are represented, that's when they start assassinating people. Right? That's when they will start engaging in violence. But as we can see, treaty revision was something that came very hard. Right? It came with a lot of violence. It came with a lot of struggle in order to get rid of these unequal treaties. Okay, no one had any questions about the names. Make sure you're reviewing the names. We'll do our true and false later, but make sure you review those. No one had any questions here thus far on section 5. We had this question though: why did and didn't Japan win the Sino-Japanese War? Right? So one thing I wanted us to understand was, despite how people remembered it, remember I tried to draw a division between how people remember why they won a war versus how they actually won the war. Right? So you remember we watched that terrible movie clip where the Chinese were like waving swords and we're just terrible at fighting? That's not how it worked. The Chinese had a pretty good army that was technologically equal to Japan on land. And remember, the Chinese actually had the advantage at sea because they had battleships. The Japanese had no battleships, right? The Chinese army was pretty good. And remember, China had more resources as well. Right? China had fundamentally more resources. However, Japan was better at supplying their soldiers. Right? The Japanese soldiers were more likely to have the ammunition that they needed. And I gave you that example where in China, some officials had taken the gunpowder out of the shells fired by the naval guns and sold it, so they had sand, and they put sand in there instead. Right? That didn't happen to the Japanese. When Japanese soldiers fired a cannon shell, they knew it was going to explode. Right? Chinese weren't so sure. So the Japanese were relatively well supplied. They were better coordinated. Remember I talked about how the Chinese Navy would not support each other, right? There was the Northern Fleet and the Southern Fleet, and they wouldn't help each other out because the Chinese government was afraid that if one Chinese commander had that much power, they would overthrow the government, right? The Japanese were never worried about that. There was never a question during this time period that the army would try and overthrow the government. It was unthinkable. And so the Japanese had relatively well-coordinated forces. And what this meant was, even though China had more troops overall, in most battles, the Japanese actually had more soldiers. Right? So in any individual battle, the Japanese usually had more soldiers than the Chinese. And so this was basically because of the radical reform Japan had undertaken. Right? They had made sure to encourage nationalism, democracy. They had built a strong economic infrastructure that would allow them to fight a war across the ocean, and it worked. Right? So it wasn't a case of, we watched that movie where it's just the Japanese won because they're awesome, right? As Chris pointed out, plot armor, right? Like it's just the idea, we're Japanese, we're awesome, that's why we win. It's not that at all. Japan won because they undertook these radical reforms that allowed them to field a pretty good army and so keep that army well supplied. What is meant by the term imperial democracy? There's a tendency to try and put, sometimes people talk about empire and democracy like they're opposites, but they can go together just fine. And this is an example of that. Right? So the Sino-Japanese War was popular, but it was still expensive. An empire is expensive, even though they got all this money from China. And there's a problem in Japan, remember, because what determined whether you got the right to vote until 1925, remember there was two things. You had to be a guy, and you had to pay a certain number of taxes. In this time period, it was literally the 1%. Right? People complain in the United States about how 1% rule everything. In Japan, it's literal. There was 1% of the people could vote because they paid enough taxes. So this led to riots and disturbances. People were upset and angry because they didn't feel like they were represented, and they weren't represented, right? They didn't have the right to vote. So in 1900, in response to the growing empire and the growing expenses of the empire, the Japanese government lowered the amount of taxes you had to pay in order to take part in voting, and that doubled the electorate from about 1% to 2%. It's growing, right? Remember, 1925 we'll have universal manhood suffrage. So the key thing is democracy and empire go together just fine. What were the characteristics of Russian expansion? How did Japan react and why? So remember, Japan had defeated China in the Sino-Japanese War and had taken over the Liaodong Peninsula. Right? Remember that peninsula right by Korea. The Japanese had taken it, taken Port Arthur after heavy fighting and a massacre of Chinese troops there. And then Russia had said, oh no, that's bad for peace in the East. You can't control that piece of China. That will cause instability. Give it back. And remember, then Russia got France and Germany to back them up. And they had a naval demonstration in Japan. They took their navies up to Japan and said, you guys got to give this back or there's going to be problems. And Japan was forced to give it back. We call this the triple intervention. And then 3 years later, Russia took that same territory. Right? And this is just flagrant disrespect to Japan, right? Russia says, oh, you can't have that territory because it will destabilize taking that territory from China will destabilize the region. But it's okay for us to take it, right? Just fine. So this makes Japan very upset. And Russian expands, so the Japanese are already angry, and this allows Russia to continue to expand its power into Manchuria towards Korea. And this is one thing, Japan will react to this by forming an alliance with Britain in 1902. Russia was aligned with France, which of course is Britain's traditional enemy, right? So it's going to align with Japan, which the Japanese love, right? Because it shows that they're respected, right? But also, what it means is that it won't be ganged up on, right? In the triple intervention, Russia, France, and Germany ganged up on Japan, forced it to give back its territory. This alliance means that no one's going to mess with Japan other than Russia, right? The terms of the alliance was if Japan is at war with another country and a second country intervenes, then Britain would also intervene. So if France tries to help out Russia, if Japan and Russia get in a fight, France is going to be at war with Britain. Right? So this is going to make sure that the Russo-Japanese War will just be Japan versus Russia. So very good diplomacy on Japan's part, right? They're good at diplomacy in this time period. What was the Boxer Rebellion? Why did the Japanese intervene? What were the characteristics of the Japanese army during this incident? All right, so the Boxer Rebellion was an anti-Christian, anti-foreign rising in China. Right? It's weird that we call it a rebellion because they weren't rebelling against their own government. They were rising up against foreigners and Christians, including Chinese Christians. The Japanese were the close by, so they sent a huge number of soldiers, and they also had a lot of interest in China. Right? For Britain and the United States and France, China is a place where they can make some money, where they want to expand their power, but it's far away. It doesn't really deal with their security issues. For Japan, China is close by, and is very important to Japanese security. So the Japanese are going to send in a lot of troops. And the British are busy fighting in South Africa, so they don't have a lot of troops to spare. So they're actually going to give the Japanese some money so that they will help out. The Japanese soldiers performed well. They were highly disciplined, but they tended to take high casualties because they like to launch frontal assaults with their troops closely packed together to give the assault weight. And their commanders tended to be very, very aggressive. Right? The Japanese tend to emphasize the offensive. So good soldiers, but their commanders tend to throw their lives away. Why did Japan fight the Russo-Japanese War despite the very different characteristics of the two armies? I mean, we got to remember Russia is just gigantic, right? It's huge. Compared to Japan, it has almost unlimited resources. So I had this question, why were they willing to fight? Well, Russia continued to expand into East Asia, was expanding its power into Manchuria and into Korea. They were building this thing called the Trans-Siberian Railway, which would allow them to expand even more, right? When you have a railway, you can bring in goods, you can bring in people, including soldiers. So the key thing was every day, Russia was getting stronger, right? Every day, Russia was getting stronger. It's getting progressively stronger and stronger and stronger. During the Boxer Rebellion, and they mentioned this in the video clip we watched, the Russians will station troops around the railroad that they have in Manchuria to protect the railroad. That's the ostensible purpose. Oh, there's a rebellion going on, we need to protect this railroad, so we're going to put troops in there. However, when the Boxer Rebellion is over, the Russians respond not by withdrawing those troops, but by adding more troops. So it's very clear that they're interested in staying in the region. They're interested in expanding. So the Japanese try their best to find a diplomatic solution, right? We have to stress, I'm not too big on years, but remember, this is going on for several years, that the Japanese are going to try and get the Russians to back off. They sent Ito Hirobumi, actually, to deal with the Russians, who's, as we talked about before, is the guy who wrote the Japanese Constitution. He's very important. And they will not take the Japanese concerns seriously. Like I said, the Tsar will refer to the Japanese as a bunch of monkeys, and you don't have to take monkeys seriously. So Japan says, well, Russia's getting stronger every day, so if we wait to fight them, well, they're getting stronger every day, one day we're going to have to fight them. But since they're getting stronger every day, it's better to fight them now rather than tomorrow. So let's go to war, let's roll the dice and see if we win. So the Japanese did not go into this war particularly confident in victory. They went into this war knowing there was a good chance that they were going to lose, but they had no other choice, right? They're backed into a corner. How was this victory, and that being the Russo-Japanese War victory, how is it different from that in the Sino-Japanese War? How did it shape Japanese society? So I gave you an example of this. We talked about the siege of Port Arthur, which was just frustrating for the Japanese because remember, they had already taken this once during the Sino-Japanese War. Now they have to take it again against the Russians, and it's better defended. And unfortunately, like I said, I remember I gave you that example. I said in the Boxer Rebellion, the Japanese commanders tend to be very aggressive, tend to like to launch frontal assaults. They did the exact same thing in the Russo-Japanese War. And people forget this, right? Remember, I tried to draw a difference between what people remember and what actually happened. But Japanese military morale became so low that they actually had to put MPs, military police, behind the Japanese soldiers to make sure that they would attack. Right? They had to threaten to shoot the soldiers if they ran. That's how bad things got in terms of morale. The Japanese officers were just not very creative. They couldn't think of a better idea than throwing lots and lots of guys at machine guns and artillery. The general in charge, Nogi, was incompetent. He could not read a topographic map, and what that meant was that he would make his soldiers try and attack a hill where the hill was steepest, and silly things like that. He didn't even understand the importance of this very large hill. The Russians also missed the importance of it, because if you took over this hill, 203-meter hill, you could just put artillery on it and fire directly into the city. He didn't realize it was very important, he didn't take it, and then the Russians were able to put troops there, and then he spent large numbers of soldiers' lives trying to take that hill. They finally did, and once they did, then Port Arthur surrendered. And a constant problem with the Japanese was that they would not remove high officers if they were doing a bad job. They said, oh, that will hurt morale, it makes the officer look bad, we don't want to embarrass them, so it's okay for them to keep sending troops on to their death. So this is a major problem. And you also, and I've talked about this before, we'll talk about it later, the Army and the Navy did not like each other and did not share intelligence. Right? So the different arms of the military would not support each other. So that was a major problem as well. Right. So remember we watched this video we watched the movie trailer of 203-meter hill, and it mostly involved Japanese soldiers dying. And the message was kind of like, well, that's how we win wars, is by dying. Right? We should just, if a bunch of us are willing to die, our superior Japanese spirit will eventually be able to overcome and win in the end. Right? And that's not why the Japanese won the war only, right? They could have won the war without having all those soldiers die. Right? They didn't need that. They won the war because they had successfully industrialized, they'd undergone these radical reforms, and they were just able to outlast the Russians because the Russians had such a long supply chain. Right? But the key thing was, they remember this war being won over spirit when it didn't have to be, right? They just would have been competent. They didn't have to have all those guys die, rather than focusing on logistics and planning, right? They should have focused more on how to plan a war, how to support your troops in battle. That's what wins wars, not having soldiers that are willing to die constantly when they don't need to. And I gave you this kind of battle. We talked about Admiral Togo at the Battle of Tsushima, where this Japanese naval command actually destroys a Russian navy just completely. And remember, key to their victory was their mastery of technology. Remember, they were able to know where the Russians were coming because they had like those early radio ships. They could radio commands and say, hey, the Russians are coming this way. And they had better ships than the Russians that were faster. They could fire their guns more quickly and more accurately. This is the lesson that's not learned. Right? Instead of focusing on, hey, we won this war because we had advanced technology and we knew how to use it and we had proper planning at stages, they focused on this idea of spirit, right? Which is one reason why they think they can defeat the United States later on. So the results of the war, first of all, there's this emphasis that loyalty to the emperor is the most important thing, more important than filial piety towards your parents. There's this myth of spiritual power, that what wins wars is our willingness to die. And of course, you do need soldiers who are willing to sacrifice themselves, but that's not the only thing. And even if your soldiers really, really want to win and are really willing to die, that doesn't guarantee victory, right? But for the Japanese, they're convinced that that's what makes you win. And there's this idea that, all of us should be like samurai. All of us should be warriors who are willing to die for the emperor. And a lot do die. I don't expect you to remember the exact numbers, but check out this ratio, right? The Japanese military never had more than 300,000 troops in the field at any one time. At the end of the war, 80,000 had died. So what this means is most Japanese people knew someone or had a family member who died in this war, right? This war was something that had left a deep mark on the Japanese people, and this encouraged the cult of the war dead at Yasukuni Shrine, right? So there's this sense now where people feel very close to the empire. They have had family members and friends sacrifice for the empire. And so this is going to encourage them to continue that sacrifice, right? We don't want the dead to have died in vain, so they're going to be willing to continue on this sacrifice. This puts Japan very squarely on the Asian mainland, right? Which is going to help lead to World War II, right? Japan is now on the Asian mainland. They're very, very concerned with what's going on in China, what's going on in Korea. And they're always going to be afraid now that the Russians will launch a war of revenge, right? Remember we talked about later on how their first enemy that they think they'll have to fight is Russia. But this is also a popular war that gives Japanese people a lot of pride. And even though I critiqued the Japanese war effort, we have to remember this is the first time that an Asian power had defeated a European power in modern history. And many people thought it couldn't happen. And Japan was able to pull this off. And that in itself is astounding. Okay, so that brings us then to section 6, Taisho democracy. All right, what role did General Nogi play in the imperial household? How did he respond to the death of the Meiji emperor? So remember, he was kind of depressed. He knew he had done a terrible job at Port Arthur. He had lost his own son, a couple of his sons in the Russo-Japanese War. Despite that, though, he ended up becoming the tutor of the Emperor Hirohito. But when the Emperor Meiji died, when Hirohito was about 11 or 12, Nogi decided to follow the emperor into death. This was a Japanese tradition among the high samurai that when their lord died, they would also commit suicide. And this led to a huge debate in Japanese society over whether this was a good idea or a bad idea, right? Was this something that we should praise because it shows loyalty to the emperor, or is this an outmoded kind of reactionary custom that we should get rid of, right? Was this a good thing or not? And depending on how you saw that, depending on what you thought Japan should be, right? If you thought that this was a good thing, then you think Japan should follow those traditional values. You're kind of nervous about democracy and things like that. If you thought this was a bad thing, you're a progressive person who believes in expanding democracy and so forth. What was the Taisho political crisis? This is very complex, so I'm going to try and simplify it. But remember, the key to understanding how the Meiji, or how the to understand how the Japanese democracy worked, we have to stress that the Army and Navy ministers were responsible not to the Prime Minister, they were responsible to the Emperor, right? And there was a rule that they had to be active duty. So whoever was in charge of the Army, Navy ministers in the government had to be active duty, like they had to be a general or an admiral. And if a cabinet lacked a minister, right, the government would collapse and they would have to choose a new prime minister who would try to establish a cabinet. So if the Army or Navy did not like a prime minister, they would just refuse to appoint a minister. Right? So if the Army or Navy says, oh, we don't like this guy, he's anti-Army, we're just not going to appoint a general to be your Army minister and you'll have to resign. So in 1912, when the civilian prime minister tried to cut military funding, the Army minister resigned and no one took his place. So that forced them to choose as a prime minister Katsura Taro, a former general. Right? So the Army gets the prime minister. You can see how powerful the Army is, right? They don't like a guy because he wants to cut the budget. Not only do they kick him out, they get their own man to be appointed prime minister. Then the Navy decides that it wants more money. The Navy says, well, we want more funding too. We don't want just the Army to get all the money. We want the Navy to get some money too. Remember, there's that rivalry. So they refuse to appoint a minister unless he gives them more funding. And what Katsura Taro does is gets the emperor to issue an order commanding the Navy to appoint a naval minister. And they can't resist the emperor. The emperor says, you have to appoint a naval minister. They have to do this. This leads to protests and riots in the streets because it seems so undemocratic, right? Democracy is all about compromise. You can see Katsura Taro does not want to compromise. He just wants to take care of the Army. And people are going to be angry about it, and there's going to be protests and riots. He's forced to resign. And then the next prime minister was a former Navy man. Right, so you can see how powerful the military is in this situation, in these crises. But you can also see that democracy is still a part of it. There are people in this time period who are willing to protest when the military behaves poorly. Later on, they'll be kind of suppressed. What international problems did Japan face following World War II? Right? Well, one thing, of course, was they issued those 21 demands to China in 1915. They said to China, hey, all the European powers are busy killing each other. We're going to take advantage of this situation to force you to basically become our semi-colony. If China would have accepted all 21 of these demands, it basically would have become a colony of Japan. Remember, one of them was that the Chinese would have to accept a Japanese advisor in like every part of its government. And of course, that advisor would make sure that the Japanese knew everything that the Chinese were doing, and it would allow them to interfere in Chinese government. This fails, and it just makes Japan look bad, both to the West and to China. Japan had also tried to get a racial equality clause inserted into the Treaty of Versailles ending World War I. That fails, which makes the Japanese very angry. There are massive public protests in Korea in 1919 against Japanese rule. Right, Korea was a colony of Japan at this time, so that embarrasses Japan. And then the Anglo-Japanese alliance will be replaced with multilateral treaties, like the Washington Conference and the League of Nations. And that makes Japan nervous. It liked having Great Britain having its back. So Japan's going to face a lot of international problems. They're going to make it feel excluded from the major powers. What economic problems did Japan face following World War I? One thing that happened was, remember, Japan got really rich during World War I. They made a lot of money because, the Europeans were busy killing each other and needed people to make guns and ammunition for them to use to kill each other, right? So the Japanese made a lot of money. This made some people very wealthy, and it made the zaibatsu, those business conglomerates, very powerful, and they will become increasingly involved in politics. They will use their money to bribe officials at times, but also to lobby, to support political parties that show their interests. So you're going to see business people, right, are going to start translating their money into power. Now that may not seem necessarily like a problem, but that's one reason why you're going to have some criticism of democracy later. In 1918, the price of rice will rise up so high that there are riots in the streets. And once the Europeans recover from the war, they're going to start competing with the Japanese. And one thing economically, right, they're going to be able to go back to work. And we often talk about how, the United States enjoyed like the roaring 20s. Japan doesn't really have that, or at least it's not so roaring, right? They face a stock market plunge in 1920, 9 years before that happens in the United States, right? The silk market will almost collapse in that same year, and Japan is very dependent on selling silk internationally to make money. And they had built up all this capacity during World War I. They built all these factories, they had expanded, but now they don't need it all because the Europeans have stopped fighting, so that means they're going to produce less. That means people will lose their jobs or face pay cuts, right? So it's not so roaring in the 20s in Japan. Those we talked about, there are some developments that are very positive. Next question is very simple. What was the Toranomon incident? Mon means gate, so it's the Torano Gate incident, just as an aside. And basically what it was this guy Daisuke Namba, he was angry, right? He was angry because this man was a socialist leader who had been executed in the Great Treason incident. Remember Kanosugako's incident, all that stuff? This guy had been executed. Daisuke Namba was very angry about that. Incidentally, remember, this guy was the son of a Diet member. He was like the son of a member of commerce, and he was so angry at this, he wanted revenge, and he tried to get revenge by attempting to assassinate Hirohito, who was not yet quite emperor, but was regent during this time period, but he would become emperor, right? So he's going to try and assassinate Hirohito. That will fail. Hirohito will survive. Incidentally, what I think is interesting is Taisuke Namba was declared insane and then executed. Usually you don't execute insane people, right? Usually if someone's crazy, you don't execute them. But they basically just said he must be crazy if he wanted to kill the emperor. But we don't want anyone else doing this, so we're going to kill him. What were the characteristics of party government during this time period? So one thing that's very important, and I think is fascinating, is Yamagata Aritomo will realize, he's the guy that basically started the modern Japanese army. He's this kind of crusty old conservative politician. And he says, you know what? To deal with our changing society and the growing conflict in society, we need more democracy. So even though this guy was really, really conservative, he was also pragmatic and practical. And he supported this guy, Harakei, becoming the first commoner civilian prime minister. And since he wasn't royalty, right? He wasn't from the imperial family or anything like that. He wasn't a soldier. His power came because he was the leader of a political party, right? His power comes directly from democracy. And so he will become the first, like I said, commoner civilian prime minister whose power comes from a party. And this actually works really well, right? The Army, Navy, and Foreign Ministers, excepting all the other cabinet members, will be members of his political party, right? So this actually works pretty well, right? For about 4 years until he's 3 years until he's assassinated, right? By someone who was not happy with Japan cutting its entering into the Washington Naval Conference and cutting its military budget, right? And all ultranationalists wasn't happy about that. That will break down for a couple years. You will have what's called a transcendental cabinet, meaning it has no political party. But then you'll have Japan governed by political parties from 1924 to 1932 in a two-party system in which parties will regularly switch power. And these political parties do believe in different things. So Japan is acting like a real democracy, right? This isn't fake, right? There's actual political parties that you can vote for that have different policies, and they will trade power peacefully back and forth for about 8 years. We'll talk about after the test why that stops in 1932. What changes were taking place in education, the public sphere, especially in terms of publishing and popular culture? So what's going to happen is, and I'll go through these really, really quickly, more and more people getting educated, including women, right? More and more Japanese people are getting more advanced educations. They will use their growing literacy to read a lot more. And this can range from just kind of popular novels to very serious things like literary reviews, right? So more and more people are educated. They're using that education to read more and more. Japanese people will gain access to modern popular culture as well. They'll start listening to the radio, right? More and more people have access to the radio and to movies. At the same time, though, like we talked about, this will create some anxiety because what ideas are being spread, right? Some people are going to be unhappy with the sort of ideas being spread. Okay, so we must stop talking about Pokemon for a second. Can you tell me on? It would be fun to keep talking about Pokemon. So we had this question, why did Japan become an empire? So we're moving to section 7. How was it similar and different from Western empires? Well, remember, Japan was forced to open up by the United States with aggression, right? We came into Japan and said, hey, open your doors to trade or we're going to blow you up. Here's a white flag. If you try and fight us, you're going to need it, right? So Japan entered a world through force in which imperialism was expanding, right? This was aggressive imperialism. Most countries in the world will fall under Western power during this time. And this was understood as a social Darwinistic time in which you had to eat or be eaten. right? Japan doesn't want to be eaten, so that means it must eat. Right? If you don't want to become a colony, you had better become an empire. So Japan will engage in what it understood as defensive imperialism, right? And this is key. When Japan will colonize other countries, it's not like the United States colonizing the Philippines, which is very far away and which has nothing to do with our strategic defense, for the most part. It's colonizing its neighbors who are right next to it and which it sees as posing an existential threat to itself. So its primary concern is security, but remember that's also related to economics. Remember, rich country, strong army. If we have colonies in other countries, we will have access to their resources, including things like food, because remember, Japan does not grow enough food to survive. It needs to import food. Japan also understood, like other empires, it was engaged in a civilizing mission in which it was going to share with other countries its advanced civilization, and that's why I have this picture here where you have this Japanese official, I think it's Terauchi Matsutake, removing this rock so the rays of Amaterasu can shine down on the Korean people. And there's this idea that because we're Asian, we Japanese people are Asian, we're the Asians who modernize successfully, we're best suited to share civilization with other Asians, right? Those Europeans, those Americans, they're racially different from Asians, so they're not going to do as good a job as we are, right? We'll do it the best. And there's this idea of Asianism, Asia for the Asians. Asians should unite together to work together to protect Asia from Western imperialism. How did Japanese see themselves in the colonized? What hierarchy was established? And that's why we watched this cartoon, right? Remember Donkichi, this little Japanese boy, rules over this island made up of native peoples who were darker than him, right? There's this kind of racial hierarchy. And also animals, right? To really emphasize that, right? So there's this, Japanese see themselves as bringing order and civilization to people who are still people, but are inferior and need to be kind of organized and led and governed by this more advanced civilized people. What are the Ryukyu Islands? How did Japan gain control of them? Why did Japan colonize them? So the Ryukyu Islands, here's Japan up here. Here's the Ryukyu Islands. They were originally an independent kingdom, but the Japanese will take them over eventually. Japan is concerned about these things because they're, it's hard to think of borders in the ocean, but they're right next to Japan. So the Japanese want to make sure that they have these under their control. So what will happen is, like I said, this was originally an independent kingdom that paid tribute to both China and Japan, recognized them as their overlord. But what will happen is some Ryukyu people, some people from these islands, will wash ashore in Taiwan, which was governed by the Chinese, by the Qing. And they will be killed, right? The Taiwanese will be killed. The Taiwanese will kill some of the Ryukyu people. So the Japanese launch an expedition to punish the Taiwanese people, which allows them to say, "Oh, we're the protector of the Ryukyus." This is important for international law, right? If you present yourself as the protector of a country that can't protect itself, that means you can exercise control over that country. So Japan is going to claim to be its protector. In 1879, just a few years later, it will force the last king, the last Ryukyu king, to abdicate, and they will annex these islands. And I want to emphasize, annex in this case does not mean they add them to the empire. It means they add them to Japan. So when we talk about during World War II, when American soldiers will assault the island of Okinawa, that is Japanese soil. Right? That's not part of the empire. That's understood as Japanese soil. Right? So just like, exactly. How did Japan expand into Manchuria? How did it justify that expansion? What was Manchukuo? What did Japanese hope to obtain through Manchuria? So the Russo-Japanese War gave Japan control over the Liaodong Peninsula and the whole of this Kwantung region. It also gave them the South Manchuria Railway. It had once been a Russian railway, now the Japanese control them. And it gives them the right to station an army here. Right, so that's how they're going to go hold of this territory. And this is really important because if you control the railroads, you control large amounts of territory. You can control the cities and the territory around the railroads, which is usually the most important territory. It also allows you to shape trade, and the Japanese shaped the trade to give them access to these resources. Remember that movie we watched? They were getting soybeans, which you can use to make a lot of different kinds of food. Right, soy sauce, tofu, and so forth is made from soybeans. And this also allows, by having the railways, this allows them to keep soldiers in this area and allows them to move the soldiers around. And we'll talk about how that's really important later on. And like I said, this is a very strategic area. It threatens Beijing, and it's a great place if you want to get access to Manchuria. So we also had this question, what was Manchukuo? What did Japan hope to obtain through Manchuria? How did it justify its expansion? Well, like I said, Manchukuo, remember, is a puppet state. It is nominally independent. Officially, it's independent, but it's really under Japanese control, right? The Japanese will get products, like I said, soybeans and stuff that they'll make into food. The Japanese are profiting, but they present this as also allowing Chinese people and Manchurian people to also profit. And they do to a certain degree, right? And there was this idea, remember, that they're transforming Manchuria. They're taking an area that they presented as desolate and making it so it's agriculturally productive. They present themselves as building up industry in Manchuria. And remember, the video clip ended with them having this stock market. They said, look, now Manchuria has a stock exchange, so we're developing its economy. And of course, it ended with the Yamato Hotel, right? This named after the Japanese people. They're called the Yamato race. But also it was this idea that to be Japanese is to be advanced and civilized, and we're bringing that civilization here. Make sure. Right. My apologies, I didn't include the picture, but someone had a question about, Ito Hirobumi. Remember, he's the guy that's had the Japanese Constitution. He wrote it. He was in charge of reforming Korea, right? When the Japanese, as they expanded to Korea, he tried to reform it. And because he was trying to put too much pressure on the Koreans, he was restricting Korean independence. A Korean nationalist killed him. Right? Queen Min was the last Korean queen. Queen Min was the last Korean queen. She was assassinated by the Japanese when she tried to resist Japanese imperialism. Okay, section 8, what diplomatic problems in Asia and the Pacific did Japan face? Right, we already talked about the 21 demands that caused problems. They are going to provoke the Chinese without really obtaining anything worthwhile. They'll pull back from China and try to influence China with loans. That has mixed success because the Chinese government is very weak. And Japan's fundamental problem is that it wants a weak China, so it will have access to Chinese resources, but it's scared because the Soviet Union is becoming more powerful. Right, so and that's why it wants access to those resources. The problem, though, is China is fundamentally changing. China is you're having a new China, which is becoming increasingly nationalistic and is going to be better able and better willing to fight back against Japan. We talked about this Washington Naval Conference, which was good for Japan because it was invited to the conference. That means it was recognized as a great power. From the perspective of the civilians, it was a really good deal because remember, this was an arms limitation conference, so it allowed them to reduce military spending. Right, they're going to stop having an arms race in which they're trying to build the biggest navy possible. They're going to limit it. That's good. But remember, there was an unequal ratio. The United States and Britain were allowed to have more ships than the Japanese. And this makes sense because, of course, the Americans and the British had to be concerned with not only the Pacific, the Atlantic. The Japanese only were concerned with the Pacific. But the Japanese pointed out, look, the Americans can just take their fleet from the Atlantic and bring it to the Pacific using the Panama Canal and then crush us. So they were very concerned about this. They were also bothered because it forced them to give up their alliance with England. There will be an Immigration Act in 1924 which will prevent Japanese people from coming to the United States. And we watched that video clip with a Japanese American complaining about how he was discriminated against. So this is not only insulting to Japan, but also Japan has population problems. They need an outlet for remember, they can't feed all their people. They want to have outlets for immigration, and that's being closed. So because of these issues, as we talked about, Soviet Union was seen as their first enemy, U.S. as second, and China as third. What military ideology became popular during this time period? Why? Why did the emperor support it? And that's the military of Sadao Araki, this guy here, who will become education minister eventually, and then later on army minister. But he wants a people's army for the defense of the nation under the emperor. Right, so he wants an army based on a broad group of people loyal to the emperor. So of course the emperor likes that. Right, the army is existing to defend and protect him. He likes that. He supports it. Real quick, let's see. We have the true and false. Go through these really, really quick. Itagaki Taisuke was an important independence, people's rights activist. True or false? True. True. We just talked about it. Tanaka Shozo supervised the Aisho copper mine. False. He protested against it. He thought it was terrible because it was killing people. Okumo Shigenobu lost his leg in an assassination attempt over terms for revising the unequal treaties. True. Ito Hirobumi wrote the Meiji Constitution, was later Resident General of Korea, a position that led to his assassination by Korean nationalists. True. Uchimaru Kanzo was a Buddhist monk who refused to bow to the imperial rescript since it would make the emperor greater than Buddha. False. He was a Protestant Christian. That's why he refused. And remember, he didn't do a deep bow. He just did a nod, and that was enough to get him in trouble. Japanese Imperial Guard mutinied in the Takabashi incident because they were angry about a pay cut despite fighting well. True. That is a true statement. Yasukuni Shrine is where the souls of Japanese soldiers are enshrined. True. Nogi was a tactically brilliant commander known for winning battles while minimizing casualties. Admiral Togo won a brilliant victory over a Russian fleet at Tsushima. True. Akiko Yosano wrote a poem urging soldiers on to fight the Russo-Japanese War. False. She wrote the poem, "Please, brother, do not die." Right? She was concerned about that. Uchiyama Gudo was a Buddhist monk who helped inspire Kano Sugako in the plot to assassinate the emperor. True. That is true. Yep. The Taisho emperor was a strong ruler, much like Meiji. False. He had lots of mental problems. Katsura Tairo played a major role in a political crisis because he refused to compromise, instead getting the emperor to support his position, leading to riots. True. That is true. Daisuke Namba tried to assassinate the Taisho emperor in the Toranmon incident. True. Yamagata Aritomo supported Harake as the first commoner civilian prime minister. True. Naomi is a story celebrating the liberation of Japanese women. False. It's about anxiety about Japanese women. Dainkichi was able to conquer the Ainu of Hokkaido. False. He's a cartoon character, right? The Ryukyu Islands originally formed an independent kingdom, but were ultimately annexed and became a part of Japan. True. Fumiko Kanoko was a Japanese anarchist who confessed plotting to assassinate the emperor despite not actually plotting to assassinate the emperor. True. Hirohito served as regent to his father before ultimately becoming emperor himself. Tatsukichi Minobe argued the emperor was the state. False. Organ of the state. He argued the emperor was only part of the state, and for that his books were banned. Sado Arake was a general who was part of the Imperial Way faction and wanted to form a people's army around the emperor. True. That is true. Thank you very much. I will post this.